Hello, what is up YouTube? G3 Iron here, and today we are showing off a little bit of gameplay footage of a Righteous Fire Juggernaut that I have been playing. And so far I've been enjoying this build in Hardcore Synthesis League. So for those of you that are not familiar with the channel, or maybe you're a recent visitor or recent community member of the channel, I play every other league hardcore and every other league softcore, so Synthesis was one of the leagues that I am playing hardcore, and of course have had several different builds already that I've tried out in hardcore, mostly because a lot of them have died. For whatever reason, Act 3 has been the bane of my existence this particular league. I die quite often in Act 3, and that's been rather despicable on my end. Wow, this is still really laggy, even with all of the changes. Anyway, so a little bit of info on the build. We'll, of course, go over all of the itemization and exactly what the skill tree looks like here in just a minute. But I just really quickly wanted to show you a couple things. First off, as a Righteous Fire build, it is a pretty passive playstyle in terms of how active the amount of different buttons you need to be hitting. I really only have a couple of buttons that I need to hit. I need to activate my Enduring Cry whenever I need endurance charges, which usually on Juggernaut isn't very often because my Ascendancy gives me passive Juggernaut or passive endurance charge generation, but occasionally if I cast Immortal Call, then I'll be out of endurance charges and I'll need to manually cast Enduring Cry just to make sure that I've got them up for the next pack that I run into. Occasionally I'll need to resummon my Stone Golem in case he dies. I'm not even sure what level he's at this point, but he's relatively high level. Where are you, Stone Golem? You're over here somewhere. Yeah, level 17 is where he's at right now, so not even top level. And this is not top end gear as well. I am just now level 79, pushing towards level 80, so this is not by any means a finished build. This is really just getting into the meat of the end game of any build right around level 80, where you get to start equipping all of your end game items and really get to test the limits of your build and see what they can do. In terms of defenses, of course, Righteous Fire is incredibly strong because you scale your damage off of your scaled life and energy shield, which for me, our life right now, our life pool is about 8k. It's just over 8k, which is fantastic. For defensive purposes, it means that if I need to panic flask or panic and leave the map, I've got plenty of HP to do that. I've taken a couple of big one-shot windups on this build. I did have a Beyonder boss that hit me for about 7k damage, and I dropped down to about 1000 HP. That was really scary, and that was in a tier 2 map. It was in a pen map on a Zana mission, which was terrifying. I was very terrified that in a tier 2 map I was able to take that amount of damage. In terms of my elemental defenses, they're of course capped and then overcapped because I'm using several different mechanisms to go above the regular 75 cap, mainly being Sapphire's Frame. That is the main mechanism by which we are overcapping our elemental resistances. Also, of course, on the passive tree, we've got one particular node that gives us one additional fire resistance. You want as much fire resistance as possible because Righteous Fire burns you for fire damage. So if you're able to scale up your fire resistance, then you eventually take less damage as you are walking around basically AFKing and shield charging your way into packs to then blow them up. It's a very, very fun build, believe it or not, for as maybe as boring as it might seem to play through because of how safe it is. So that's some of the enjoyment, at least in hardcore, is simply being safe, and being safe is important obviously in any league because of the experience loss, but in hardcore especially so because you don't want to lose a character and all the time that you've dumped into it. So although the character may seem like, oh wow, there's really not a whole lot going on to it, you just stand around and let stuff die around you and occasionally cast Scorching Ray. What's the fun in that? Well, it's actually quite fun because a lot of the challenge of hardcore is simply staying alive, and so we like staying alive. So let's jump into some of the itemization of this particular character. Our weapon right now is this Void Scepter, which I got this for an Alk in Hardcore Synthesis Trade League. I could not believe that somebody was selling this for an ALK, just the value that it provides to this build. So check this out. Look at the amount of stats that I actually get to take advantage of with this particular weapon. 40% increased elemental damage, +2 to level of socketed fire gems, which I'll tell you about the gems here in just a second. 30 to lightning resist, which I need the lightning resist on this particular build. Gives me 21% increased burning damage, and then gains 10% of cold damage as extra chaos damage over time. We lose out on that one. And then 16% increased damage over time crafted. Now, the reason why this is such a great mace for the level of socketed fire gems is because we are using Scorching Ray, which is, of course, a fire gem. We are using Cast While Channeling, which is a support gem. And then we're also using Wave of Conviction, which is also a fire and lightning spell. So one of the reasons why we're using this setup is because we're getting a ton of levels from this scepter in a very, very cheap and efficient way. And whenever we are holding down our Scorching Ray, not only does Scorching Ray now only give you exposure and thus reduce your enemy's fire resistances now at its maximum stacks, but now it doesn't necessarily stack up its damage, you know, instantly because of that fact. So Scorching Ray used to have essentially a straight line damage increase as it continued to stack, as more and more of your enemy's fire resistances was, you know, corroded from the ray being applied. Now that only happens at the end of it. But if you use Wave of Conviction in combination with this, every single wave that you fire out applies exposure, which is -25 to elemental resistances, matching the highest damage taken. So ideally what you do is you do a ton of fire damage with your Wave of Conviction, and then you're lowering your enemy's fire resistance. So that's the theory, at least that's the setup, that's the goal. Our helm, I believe I bought for a couple of chaos. I simply looked for helms with tons and tons of HP, and then maybe some armor here and there. I don't even have enough blacksmith stones to level up and to quality all my stuff here. This is just how great Righteous Fire is in at least in hardcore to staying alive. You just grab items that have got a ton of HP on it, and away you go. Grabbed this Sapphel's frame. I was surprised at how expensive this was. I think it was like 15 to 20 C when I got it, and I looked at it the other day. I think they're up to 30 C now in hardcore Synthesis League. So this is, of course, incredibly helpful because it gives you +4 to all maximum resistances, which is great. That allows us to push our fire resistance up. Our jewelry is a corrupted talisman. The reason why we went out and bought this is because it was cheap, and it gives us 2% of life regenerated per second. It also has life on it, as well as fire resistance and some other attributes that we need to fill in gem requirements. Our rings are not fantastic. They're really actually not even helpful outside of the life rolls. So these just have life rolls and maybe an occasional resistance on them. But the life rolls is really the big deal. This one, I have got cold damage even added onto there. Like I can scour that and maybe even potentially annul maybe the accuracy or annul the maximum life energy to improve that. So there's lots of improvement that could be made to this build, but it's done me good work so far, keeping me alive. I've, of course, got a Combs here in the chest piece. Combs right now in hardcore is going for about 240 to 300 C. It just depends on the time of day that you purchase at and whether or not you purchase cards individually, or if you are straight up purchasing a Combs in and of itself. This one can be divined up because Combs can roll between 20 to 40% increased fire damage. We got one that's 26. Our gloves, once again, repeated theme, just get maximum life, and then anything else that's on there is just bonus. Our boots are heavily invested in triple resistance, which was great. These were actually boots that I and a guildie Beckett found, and then we've been tossing back and forth as we've been using different characters and leveling with different characters. Thankfully, they have not been ripped to standard yet, as of the making of this video. Of course, now I'll go and do another map, and they'll go to standard. But boots have got life and triple resistance, which is great. My belt, I'm using a Stygian Vise that gives me a bunch of life, as well as some crafted resistances, and then, of course, a regular jewel that's giving me some life and some more resistances. I really ought to regal this. I mean, this is just really lazy on my part that I haven't regaled that, just for the potential chance of another stat line I could be using. In terms of flasks, we're using a Hallowed Hybrid Flask of Heat, which removes freeze and chill during the flask effect. I always like to have one of these as a hybrid because if you are sitting around just spamming your Scorching Ray, you could potentially, if you're fighting a long enough boss, need to actually pop a flask to give yourself more mana. If you've been shield charging around a bunch, or you've had to resummon your stone golem, it's another thing that quality of life wise, you don't want to run out of mana when you need to apply that exposure to get a little bit more DPS. Secondly, I've got a Surgeon's Topaz Flask of Dowsing. You might be wondering, why on earth would you be running a Flask of Dowsing on a Righteous Fire build? It is because that is the emergency shutoff valve. This is my fire hydrant flask, that when I see myself take a hit or even start taking a little bit of damage, I can panic and just push this, and it instantly removes Righteous Fire. So if you look, I'm burning here with Righteous Fire. As soon as I use my Surgeon's Flask, away goes Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire does not actually turn off if you have it equipped, and even if you unequip it, where's my Righteous Fire? Here it is. Even if you unequip it, it'll work here, and then once you re-equip it, boom, it turns back on. So unless you want to be in an encounter, in a map, and constantly opening up your inventory and manually turning off your Righteous Fire and then having it turn back on, it's really nice to have a Flask of Dowsing to simply go, oh, I got hit, I got a big hit, I need to regen a whole bunch of my life back, so you use your Flask of Dowsing. Also, we've got an Alchemist's Ruby Flask of Craving. The added effects on this are simply don't matter. I really need to change this up. Really need to dump some more currency into my flasks. But nonetheless, this is very helpful for the less fire damage taken. And of course, it also applies to the righteous fire damage that we are taking. So it gives you a little bit more mitigation of that damage as your righteous fire is up. Then we've got a Basalt Flask of Heat. This gives you additional physical damage reduction and also gives me a freeze immunity flask. Why on earth, Iron, would you use two flasks to give you freeze immunity? You've got it on your Basalt Flask and you've got it on your Hybrid Flask. And I will tell you why, because I have terrible, terrible flask discipline. So for me, if I open up a chest and it freezes me and I accidentally already popped all of my flasks once or many of my flasks once, or I'm simply dry running up to the chest, I want to have a second flask that if it is a freeze flask, I can get away from it very, very quickly. I've lost characters to that. Some of you are going to look at that and just go, get good, scrub. That's totally fine. Feel free to comment down below, get good, scrub. But the reality is, for me, knowing my own playstyle and knowing my own bad habits, I'm recognizing that and trying to adjust my gameplay accordingly. Then we've got the Chemist Stibnite Flask of Staunching. This creates a smoke cloud on use, gives me a whole bunch of evasion. Woohoo, who cares? Really, this is just a flask there because it gives me the smoke cloud and removes bleeding on use, so I really shouldn't need to use it all that much. Okay, so those are the flasks. What about the passive tree? Passive tree looks like so. You start out coming over and maybe even grabbing some of these melee damage nodes because you probably won't be leveling with Righteous Fire. A lot of different people have opinions about when you can swap over to Righteous Fire. I'll just give you mine really quickly. I swapped over to Righteous Fire at about level 70-ish. So I actually leveled all the way through Blood Aquas and finished pretty much the entire game up until Kitava, including all 3 of my Trials of Ascendancy before killing Kitava, and then really devoting myself over to Righteous Fire. So that was just my approach because I wanted to make sure that I was level 70 and had all of my gear. So once I had all of my gear, could equip my Saffrels, and could put on my combs, then I swapped over to Righteous Fire and went in and took out Kitava. So we've got Endurance Charge Generation down here towards the bottom. We've got Maximum Life and Regen down here towards the bottom. Then you're going to come up and swing around. I've still got more points that I can put in here at the Scion Life Tree. Come around, you're going to grab Barbarism, which gives you your plus to maximum fire resistance. You're going to come grab some Endurance Charge Generation, which is great. I've still got another Jewel Socket that I can fill in over here as I get more levels. You're going to come up and you're going to grab some more HP regen over here with some Jewel Sockets. And then, of course, more maximum life over here with Devotion and more Endurance Charges. Come all the way back up and around for Purity of Flesh, which gives you more Chaos Resistance, more maximum life. And then I went and got Holy Fire, which gives us a bunch more fire damage as well. All of my gems pretty much look the same. They all give me maximum life and then burning damage. I actually got really lucky in Hardcore because there was another player in Hardcore that had 3 of these jewels that all had rolled maximum life on them and burning damage on them. And he had ripped his Hardcore Righteous Fire guy. I believe he said like level 50, and so he wasn't even using the jewels yet on his build. So I got a whole bunch of these jewels from this one guy that had really good rolls on the burning damage as well as maximum life. So I got really, really lucky there. Probably from here on out at level 80, I'm really only going to plan about another 10 passives. So for me, I've got 3 more passives that I can fill in here on the Scion Life Wheel. I've got 2 more passives, so that brings me up to 5 over here for another Jewel Socket. and then I may potentially come get another 3 socket over here. I may come up and grab the increased elemental damage socket over here. So either way, those are kind of the 2 options. You can, of course, use elemental equilibrium if you'd like to. You can shield charge into stuff and elementally equilibrium any pack that you hit with your AoE. That's really nice to do. And then I've also got a debate if I'm going to come up here, grab the increased area of effect with Amplify, just for added AoE quality of life. So that's what the build is looking like. In terms of links, we've got Elemental Focus linked to Righteous Fire, Burning Damage Support, and then an Empower. I need to level this sucker up. I'm just leveling it because I've got the sockets to do it. It doesn't even matter. The damage is good right now for the number of maps and the content that I am doing. I imagine I'm going to want to push into higher tier maps as I level into my 80s, but that's where we're at right now. I've got a 4-link setup with Enduring Cry, Summon Stone Golem, Vitality, and Purity of Fire. Eventually I'm going to want the Empower on Purity of Fire and Vitality. Of course, we already went over a Wave of Conviction cast while channeling and Scorching Ray setup. In my helm, I've got Leap Slam, Immortal Call, and Feeble and Cast When Damage Taken support. One mental note on this, there is excellent discussion to be had in this debate on whether or not you want Immortal Call to be set up on a Cast When Damage setup or on a manual setup. I have Immortal Call set up on a manual setup because I want to constantly be in charge of when I have endurance charges and when I don't. Right now, with my number of endurance charges that I generate and with the duration and level that I've got into Immortal Call, I believe it lasts for about 4 seconds. So that's 4 seconds of physical immunity. It's plenty of time for me to generate new endurance charges. It's plenty of time for me to swap between having Immortal Call running to then casting Enduring Cry to then regenerate more endurance charges, which is great. That works out really well for me when I take a big hit. So that's why I choose to use manual Immortal Call. For many of you, and for most builds, a Cast When Damage Taken setup is superior for Immortal Call, but when you are so reliant on endurance charges, and for me I get up to like 83% physical mitigation on my endurance charges with my endurance charges up. That's a ton of physical mitigation. So yes, I can simply become invulnerable for a period of time, but over the course of several subsequent small hits, I would much rather have that physical mitigation. So it simply depends on the scenario that you are in, and you can always swap that out as needs be. Some other itemization that I'm probably going to want to upgrade at some point. I need to debate whether or not I'm going to sync the Chaos and Exalted into upgrading these rings or not and swapping over to Combs rings. And I just, at the moment, I think I like the life. I like having 8,000 life. That's really, really nice. It feels good. But having 2 additional endurance charges would also be really, really strong and would up my Chaos resistance. So there's give and take here. There's lots of flexibility in the build. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you've got any questions about the build, any feedback, you can, of course, leave us a comment down below. How is your synthesis experience going today? For me, it's going great because this guy hasn't died yet, and I'm about halfway from level 79 to level 80. Hopefully, I'll hit level 80 over the weekend, and we'll go from there with whether or not this guy rips and it's time for a new character, or maybe he'll stay alive and maybe I can push for 90 for it. That would be awesome. Anyway, have a great rest of your day, everybody. And I hope that today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you right after you get done watching this video.